Hello, I'm Michael Spence. I'm President and Provost here at University College London. And this lecture is a part of our activities to remember the Holocaust and its victims and to contribute to improving understanding of the Holocaust and especially of its ongoing effects and ramifications. And so our portico will be lit purple on Friday to mark the day. And we have a number of other events during this week, including a talk with a Holocaust survivor, Ruth Posner, organized by our University and Jewish Society. Well, as you probably know, the theme of this year's Holocaust Memorial Day is ordinary people. And that reflects the fact that the terrible events of those years happened to people just like you and me, but were also perpetrated by people just like you and me. And I think that's particularly important to remember in a university, given our particular proclivities. You know, we tend to be people who believe in high culture, and the Weimar Republic was a great flowering of high culture, and yet the Holocaust happened. We tend to be people who believe in education, and of course, so too did the Weimar government. And indeed, there was even in the Weimar Constitution a guarantee of religious tolerance in education, and yet the Holocaust happened. And the Holocaust impacted, affected, slaughtered people just like you and me. And the people who were responsible for that were people just like you and me. But I think if there is a moment of hope, it's that also we know from that period and beyond that ordinary people just like you and me can play a bigger role than we might imagine in combating prejudice. And part of the point of remembering is to rededicate ourselves to that purpose. Well, today's lecture shows just how enormously resonant the Holocaust remains in modern Europe, with the battle over its memory and legacy being a key theme in Russia's war against the Ukraine. The Jewish history of Ukraine is rich and fascinating, and we have a terrific speaker to look with us through this complex history and what it means today. Ulian Blacher is an associate professor of Ukrainian and Eastern European studies in our School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies. He worked on the history and culture of Ukraine and the wider region, and is a translator of Ukrainian literature. His work also includes Holocaust memory and memorial in Ukraine, and how that's changed in the post-war years through the Soviet era and following Ukraine's independence in 1991, in particular, the memorial at Babyn Yar. This is going to be a fascinating lecture, and I'll waste no more time before handing over to Ulian, except to say that there will be time for questions at the end of the lecture, and you can submit those at any time via Slidos. Details of how to do that should be in the chat shortly, but welcome, Ulian.
Thank you so much, Michael, for this introduction, and thank you also to the organizers of the lunch hour lectures for inviting me to mark International Holocaust Memorial Day. As Michael alluded to, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we are living through, once again, a major war in Europe. So I think it's very, very important, maybe more important than ever, to look back at the Second World War and the Holocaust and see what we can learn from those events which were, after all, to a large degree focused in Ukraine. My talk today will focus partly on Holocaust commemoration, but the focus will be broader. I'll be talking about how Ukraine as a Jewish space is remembered in Ukraine today and what significance that has in the context of Russia's war on Ukraine. Ukraine obviously is a place, a very important place in Jewish history, and Jews have a very important place in Ukrainian history. These are stories which cannot be told separately. The story is not always a happy story. It's obviously Ukraine was one of the main locations for the Holocaust, the epicenter of the so-called Holocaust by bullets, but it was also a place that saw pogroms in the early 20th and late 19th century, and in previous eras as well, in the 18th century and the 17th centuries. At the same time, Ukraine has also been a place of Jewish life and of Jewish culture, of Jewish ideas. Ukraine is the birthplace of Hasidism. It's really the epicenter of the phenomenon of the shtetl, It's a place in the early 20th century where modern secular Jewish culture, Yiddish language culture flourished. And a great many Jewish writers, artists, thinkers, political figures are connected in various ways with Ukraine, from writers like Shalom Aleichem and Joseph Roth to Bruno Schulz or Paul Celan, through to political figures like Vladimir Zev Jabotinsky or Golda Meir. This diverse and complex history, however, has been obscured in Ukraine for a long time. It's been poorly understood, often by Ukrainians themselves, but also in many ways by Jews too, whether in Ukraine or in the diaspora with connections to Ukraine. And one of the main reasons for this, not the only reason, but one of the main reasons I will suggest in this talk today is empire. Is Ukraine's status as a colonial possession of first the Russian Empire and then also the USSR. So how exactly is empire responsible for certain lack of knowledge and understanding of Ukraine as a Jewish place, as a Jewish space? There is an idea that I've heard certainly repeated by Ukrainian and also Jewish intellectuals who were part of the dissident movement in the post-war period, in the later Soviet period, that as a result of Soviet propaganda, Jews and Ukrainians were ignorant not only of one another's history, but each of them individually of their own histories. So there's this combination of a certain lack of self-knowledge combined with a lack of dialogue and a lack of knowledge of the other. Because of Ukraine's history of belonging to different empires, different states for hundreds of years, for most of its history being divided between different states, Ukrainian sense of their own history has often been quite fragmented and distorted. Something similar we could say about Jewish history of the region. Jews obviously living in different states, in different empires, split among different political and cultural contexts, leading to a certain fragmentation of what Jewish history as a coherent entity could be. The historical narrative imposed under the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union are obviously very different in many ways, but in some key ways, very similar. This was a historical narrative that had a central distinctive place neither for Jews nor for Ukrainians, both groups which sat further down the imperial hierarchy, both in different ways, but certainly in some similar ways, seen as inferior groups, as backward groups, not as legitimate collective historical subjects. On the one hand, somewhat ridiculous, the focus of many jokes, but also, on the other hand, threatening, the focus for many conspiracy theories. Ukrainian and Jewish historians and intellectuals, when they did try to construct their own stories from their own cultural points of view to correct the position assigned them in the imperial narrative, often did so with little regard to one another, with essentially their closest neighbours. As is often the case in identity projects that are built in opposition to an overbearing imperial narrative, anti-colonial narratives, they are often defensive, they are often inward-looking. When Ukrainians and Jews did look beyond the national context, and they often did do that, they looked towards universalizing ideas such as socialism or communism. In the early 20th century, or on the other hand, we should also talk about the tendency toward assimilation into whereby the cultural origins are foregone or relegated to a secondary position in order to assimilate into an identity with greater prospects. And that happens in the case of both Ukrainians and Jews in different empires. When we get into the Soviet period, the Soviet nationalities policy, which sought to recognize nationalities on the one hand, but also exacerbated the situation by forcing people into national boxes and kind of dividing off the different national groups from one another in a hierarchy of nationalities within the Soviet Union, even indicating this in people's passports. And all of this subjugated to what was still, nevertheless, a Russocentric, Moscow-centric Soviet master narrative, in the context of which dangerous marks of distinctiveness that might lead to separatism were frowned upon, removed, often quite forcibly, through violence. For Ukrainians, the accusation was often of bourgeois nationalism, and for Jews, increasingly Zionism. This has implications after the war for the memory of the Holocaust, which was virtually erased from Soviet memory culture, the central place in which was given to Soviet victimhood and also victory over Nazi Germany, over fascism. And the Holocaust itself, the specific fate of the Jews, did not have a place in Soviet memory culture. And pursuing commemoration of the Holocaust could again lead to these accusations of nationalist particularism and was associated with Zionism as well. The restrictions, Soviet restrictions on Holocaust memory are, I think, a good example of how an imperial narrative precludes self-knowledge and dialogue between Ukrainians and Jews. The story of the Holocaust was, after all, a story of Nazi-occupied territories of the Soviet Union. In other words, primarily a story that affected Ukraine and Belarus, which, of course, happens to overlap with, to a large extent, with the old Pale of Settlement from Russian imperial times, and where the majority of the Jewish populations in the Soviet Union still lived. The erasure of the Holocaust was, of course, first and foremost an erasure of Jewish history, but it's also an erasure of Ukrainian history. And it was accompanied by a broader erasure of the specifics of the Ukrainian experience of World War II, which was an experience of victimhood under the Soviets as much as victimhood under the Nazis. What's more, the story of the victimization of Jews by Ukrainian nationalists during the war was also silenced under this narrative. Ukrainian resistance was dismissed as fascist under Soviet rhetoric, but the fact that Jews were targeted by nationalists and the complex and difficult Ukrainian-Jewish relations during the war simply disappeared from view, meaning that very urgent conversations between Ukrainians and Jews had to wait decades to happen. When we get to 1991, then we have a situation where in Western Europe, countries have been slowly, painfully trying to come to terms with the Holocaust with varying degrees of success. But in the Soviet Union, it's been ignored and silenced, and the necessary debates have barely begun in Ukraine. One of the most interesting books about the Jewish history of Ukraine is a book by the historian Shimon Redlich, which is called Together and Apart in Brzeżany. So it's a sort of micro history about a small town in Galicia, Western Ukraine, and it's the story of everyday life, everyday contacts between Ukrainian and Jewish neighbors, and how, even with this intimate physical proximity, certain invisible borders exist, and these can at some point turn into deadly divisions. And in some ways, this serves as a microcosm of the larger historical and cultural memory of Ukrainians and Jews, which are so intimately connected and intertwined, but often have been separated and often break out into these discursive conflicts. Because of all this, in the first years of Ukrainian independence, there are no Holocaust museums, there are very few memorials, there are no museums of Jewish history, and Jewish heritage, and Ukraine has a very, very rich physical heritage, was often neglected. The level of knowledge and understanding among Ukrainians of the Jewish past of their times was very low. Of course, we're talking about a country going through profound political and economic crises where roads and hospitals can barely be built, never mind museums and memorials, but still, this is not just a question of economics. At the same time, I think it's fair to say that the understanding of Ukrainian identity, history, and culture among Jewish diasporas with roots in Ukraine and also among Jews in Ukraine itself, has been somewhat incomplete or fueled by certain stereotypes, and has often also been influenced by the Russian or Soviet narrative, whereby the Ukrainians are seen as a backward group who are barely perceived as worthy of the status as a cultural and historical interlocutor. So I think these broader imperial frameworks, whether Tsarist or Soviet, are clearly at play here. And this is certainly part of the discourse in contemporary Ukraine. And here, if you just bear with me, I'm going to share some slides. Just 1 second. To illustrate this, there's a telling scene in a contemporary novel by a very popular writer called Yuri Vinnichuk, set in Lviv, which deals in part with the history of the Holocaust in Lviv, and one of actually quite a few contemporary Ukrainian novels which do treat this topic. In the novel, there's a scene where the protagonists discuss why there is no the site of the Yanishsky concentration camp, which functioned during the Nazi occupation of Lviv, is so poorly marked, so poorly commemorated in the city. And the answer that's given is that this was because of the Soviets. The Soviets erased the history of the Second World War. They erased the history of multicultural Lviv, of Jewish Lviv. And as the character said, Lviv bears no responsibility for this. We were just part of a colony. The colonizers decided everything. And so everything that I've been saying up till now is certainly part of the cultural conversation in Ukraine, this idea that memory of the Holocaust, memory of Jewish Ukraine is profoundly affected by Soviet propaganda. Of course, there is definitely something to this, but it's not the whole story. We must also allow for the influence of inward-looking nationalist thinking. The desire to save the nationalist anti-Soviet resistance from the stain of Holocaust collaboration is an important factor. And there are also centuries of prejudice born of everyday social, cultural, political, economic tensions. And Ukrainians and Jews are, I think, despite empire, quite capable of ignoring one another outside of that context. Having said all this, and whatever the reasons for it are, the story of Jewish Ukraine is not only one of mutual ignorance of being separate and apart. Today's Ukraine certainly is no longer a place where oblivion about the Jewish past rules, and indeed the Ukraine of the past has not always been a place of conflict and persecution. There are now new sites of Holocaust memory in Lviv, for example. Babyn Yar in Kiev, which was mentioned in the introduction, has been the focus of a lot of commemorative activity in recent years. Today, while anti-Semitism still exists, is still a problem in Ukraine, as it is in many European countries, Ukrainian Jews are generally seen increasingly as an integral part of the Ukrainian civic nation, and they themselves, by all accounts, increasingly feel that way. And much as Russia would like us to think that Ukraine has been overrun by the far right, Ukrainian society has in fact quite resoundingly rejected far-right parties repeatedly at the ballot box. So the story of Ukraine is recently more one of civic nationalism, where it's not at all strange for a Jew to feel proudly patriotic about Ukraine, or indeed fight and indeed die for Ukraine in the current war, or that the broad mass of those who identify as ethnic Ukrainians might support overwhelmingly a Jewish president. Mistakes are still being made, of course, and blind spots still exist, and there was a very clear illustration of that on the 1st of January this year, when the Parliament of Ukraine tweeted a quote from Stepan Bandera, the far-right wartime World War II nationalist leader, whose organization was responsible for violence against Jews. A tweet that was at least subsequently and fairly quickly deleted. And that instance shows that things are never quite straightforward. Things are always a little bit complicated in the Ukrainian-Jewish dialogue in that encounter. Despite attempts often to paint them as simple and as straightforward, as black and white. Historians and commentators, I think, still tend to focus either entirely on the negative or entirely on the positive, focusing on conflict and prejudice or on the signs of progress. But in truth, the only way to understand all of this history is to accept and embrace its ambiguity, its paradoxes, and its contradictions. A few examples of that. If we look at the 19th century Ukrainian literary classics at the birth of the Ukrainian national idea, we see anti-Semitic images in some of the classic works of Ukrainian literature, even in the works of the national poet Taras Shevchenko. And these are moments that often come up in debates over Ukrainian anti-Semitism historically. At the same time, we can look at the same period and see a public letter of 1858 signed by leading Ukrainian intellectuals with protests against anti-Semitism in the Russian imperial press. And one of the signatories being Taras Shevchenko, and the letter outlining specifically that it's specifically Ukrainian intellectuals who are best placed to understand the problems and suffering of the Jews within the empire, since they have an intimate historical knowledge of interaction with Jews, being Ukrainians. Later in the 19th century, we see the work of Ivan Franko, another great canonical Ukrainian writer, who writes harsh critiques of Jews as economic exploiters of Ukrainians. Critiques that often border on the anti-Semitic use of anti-Semitic tropes and images. And yet at the same time, the same writer will dedicate entire novels to sympathetic Jewish characters. He will explore Ukrainian-Jewish solidarity in his prose and journalistic work. He will collect Jewish folk songs and translate them into Ukrainian. He'll publish Jewish authors in his journal. And he'll write an epic poem called Moses, in which he compares the Ukrainians to the Jews, and which in the Soviet Union was banned for its Zionist implications. And not without reason, since Franko was an admirer of Theodor Herzl. And you can see here, there's the cover of a 2016 edition of this poem, which is published together with the Ukrainian translation of Herzl's Jewish State. After the First World War, there was an attempt to create a Ukrainian nation state along the lines of the others that were appearing in Central Europe at the time, the Ukrainian People's Republic. And this period is often seen from outside of Ukraine through the prism of the pogroms that accompanied the complex multilateral conflict at the time. Yet the Ukrainian People's Republic did attempt to carve out a space for Jews within it. It had a minister for Jewish affairs, and it even had money. Its currency had the Yiddish language printed on it. The Ukrainian People's Republic also, although it existed only for a few years, was a place where Jewish arts and culture began to flourish. Later, if we look to the Soviet Ukrainian dissident movement after the war, a movement which was very much focused on the protection of Ukrainian national culture and language, but it was also a movement that was outward-looking in some senses, and some of its leading members, such as the dissident Ivan Dzyuba, risked severe punishment to attend and speak at illegal Holocaust commemorations that took place in Kiev at the site of Babyn Yar. And Dzyuba in 1966 made a very famous speech calling for reconciliation between Ukrainians and Jews and a better understanding of one another's history. So we can see that throughout their cultural history, Ukrainians have looked at Jews, considered their relationships with them. In the same way, if we look at the cultural history of Jews in Ukraine, we can see the same process coming from the other direction. Sometimes we have to read between the lines a little bit, but it's certainly there. So if we look at famous writers who came out of Ukraine, like Shalom Aleichem, for example, whose works are very famous, but often misinterpreted and misunderstood as being about Russia. They are about the Russian Empire, but they're set in Ukraine. In his stories, the peasants, who appear frequently, are Ukrainians, and isn't the famous story of Hava and Hvedka, who fall in love across religious divisions, a story of Ukrainian and Jewish closeness and distance. There are few writers who, in any language, who describe small-town central Ukraine in the late 19th century in the way that Shalom Aleichem does. And he was influenced in doing that by the work of Ukrainian writers. Nikolai Gogol, a writer from the same part of Ukraine as Shalom Aleichem, or not far, was a big influence. And Shalom Aleichem knew the work of the Ukrainian national poet Taras Shevchenko and could read it and even recite it. At the same time, when we read Shalom Aleichem's work, it's very difficult to find Ukrainians as Ukrainians, named as such. And these works are kind of oblivious to the nature of these characters, their needs, and their desires. They're quite one-dimensional, they're quite stereotyped. And it's something, this is a tendency we find in other Jewish writers. If we go to the other part of Ukraine outside of the Russian Empire, Yosef Roth, who came from Galicia, author of the Radetzky March, who grew up in a town just on the border between the Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires, brilliantly captures multicultural Galicia in his works, inserting Poles and Jews and Ukrainians and others into this kind of nostalgic, almost carnival parade in stories like The Bust of the Emperor, for example. But yet, again, the Ukrainian characters remain somewhat caricatured. Finding evidence of them as Ukrainians can be a little bit difficult, although of course Yosef Roth famously skeptical of all national projects and increasingly nostalgic for the multicultural empire. Some Jewish intellectuals did pay very close attention to Ukrainian questions, Ukrainian culture. So just as Ivan Franko was inspired by Theodor Herzl's Zionism, Vladimir Zeev-Jabotinsky was inspired by the figure of Taras Shevchenko. He wrote an essay on the importance of the national poet and his liberatory stance, anti-imperial liberatory stance, which for Jabotinsky could fend off and help fend off Russian imperial chauvinism on behalf of all peoples of the imperial South, including Jews. Ukrainians and Jews, Ukrainian Jewish writers and intellectuals have not always perceived or written about one another as others from opposing sides of a dividing line, but they've also participated in the same cultural processes. So if we look at the Ukrainian People's Republic period from 1918 into the early 1920s, we see the appearance of the Kulturliga, and we see the state institutions, these new state institutions being established under the Ukrainian nation state, keen to engage Jews. The Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, which is set up, has Jewish research centers. And Jewish artists are among those of multiple ethnicities who are working in the Kiev Art School or the newly established Ukrainian National Academy of Arts. And here you see a very interesting process whereby Ukrainian and Jewish artists who've previously perhaps struggled to express their specific national culture in art and culture are coming together and doing something very similar, trying to express and develop and articulate a modern and modernist, mostly vision of art and culture, but with a national specific. And so we have artists like, for example, Manuel Shechtman, who lives and works in Ukraine for a long time, and who is a student of the Ukrainian painter Mikhailo Boychuk, who works at the Academy of Arts in Kiev. And you can see that here Shechtman's portrayals of pogrom victims is influenced by his teacher Boychuk's depictions of Ukrainian peasants. And there are lots of examples of this kind of interaction and mutual influence between artists of this period. These institutions become absorbed into new Soviet ones when the Bolsheviks seize control of Ukraine. They tend to lose their autonomy. The Kulturliga, for example, loses its autonomy. But these processes do continue to a certain degree. And if we look at the 1920s in Soviet Ukraine, we see writers turning to, not entirely for the first time, that Jewish writers start writing in the Ukrainian language. It does happen in the 19th century, but certainly for the first time in any significant way. And so we see writers, important writers of the period in Kharkiv, which was the capital of Soviet Ukraine at the time, turning to the Ukrainian language. Traditionally, Jewish writers would have written either in Yiddish or Hebrew, or the dominant state languages in the states that they existed, that they lived in, Russian, German, or Polish, generally when we speak about Ukraine. But here they start to write in Ukrainian. So figures like Leonid Pervomaisky or Rais Troyanka, among the sort of modernist avant-garde poetic circles of the time. And if we look at Kharkiv, Soviet culture in Kharkiv, where we had for the first time Ukrainian language as the state language, Ukrainian culture being endorsed by the state, something which was, Ukrainian intellectuals at the time fought hard for in the context of the new Soviet state. We see, again, a great mixing of Ukrainian and Jewish artists living in the same buildings, working on the same theater projects, cinema projects, and so on. But this is not only a story that's happening in Soviet Ukraine. If we look at interwar Poland, you can see a similar mixing of cultures within the same artistic milieu. So, for example, the artist group is a very interesting example, where you had artists of Polish, Jewish, and Ukrainian background, often mixed backgrounds, working together in the same groups. And a good example being the married couple, Margit Reich-Sielska or Selska, and Roman Selski, here, who were two artists who were working in the interwar period, in the avant-garde period, and then also together afterwards in Soviet Ukraine, when Lviv becomes part of Soviet Ukraine. He was of Ukrainian origin, she was of Jewish origin. And in more recent times, you can see also this tradition of Ukrainian language Jewish literature continues. So poetry by the likes of Moshe Fishbein, one of the most important poets of the kind of around about the period of Ukraine becoming independent, or Boris Khersonsky, very famous poet from Odessa, who previously wrote in Russian, but now writes increasingly in Ukrainian as a political choice, and very much a kind of spokesperson for Ukrainian culture abroad, but also for the kind of Jewish-Ukrainian dialogue within the country. So whichever way we look at it, this is a story of intertwining cultures. Sometimes they are far apart for all of their proximity, but sometimes this togetherness and even hybridity emerges in interesting ways. Now, I've already spoken about the imperial context of the past, but what does all this mean right now, in the present, in the context of Russia's war, which is in many ways a continuation of the imperial mindset, imperial aggression of the past? Well, first, I think all of this is important because of the results of Russian propaganda. Ukrainians' attitudes towards the Jewish past of Ukraine, their Jewish compatriots, have come under a microscope. The darker sides of Ukrainian nationalism have come into focus. It is perhaps in many ways unfair that this should happen in these circumstances through the disingenuousness of Kremlin propaganda. And certainly we shouldn't allow that propaganda to dictate our talking points. But these are topics which carry weight and meaning, which are important, and they're important regardless of what Moscow says about them. Ukraine, and here I'm talking about the state, but also intellectuals, historians, cultural actors, has to take this seriously. I think it increasingly is taking it seriously, and it can turn this problem into an opportunity. Embracing, celebrating, speaking honestly about the Jewish past will no doubt raise Ukraine's image in the eyes of important allies. It affords important soft power possibilities for Ukraine. And it has begun to embrace the Jewish cultural figures and historical figures who are connected to Ukraine and who can provide important bridges to Europe, to the US, to Poland, more specifically, or to Israel. A good example of that is the Agnon Literary Center in Buchach in Western Ukraine, so named after the writer Shmuel Yosef Agnon, who came from that city and who wrote very famously about it. And it's a literary center which invites Ukrainian writers to come and reflect on the legacy of Agnon, but also of the history of the city, the history of Ukrainian-Jewish coexistence, and has also established links with the Agnon House in Jerusalem. And this and similar initiatives are becoming more and more common in Ukraine and more central to the cultural process. This, of course, is not all about just looking good in the eyes of one's neighbors, in the eyes of the US or the EU or of Israel. It's something of a cliche to suggest that Ukraine is a country discovering or rediscovering its identity. This is one thing that, as someone who studied Ukrainian culture for a long time, I don't buy. There's one thing you understand studying Ukrainian culture is that this sense of identity and distinctiveness has never gone away. And it's always been fiercely protected. But of course, a society's sense of itself changes. It reacts to new challenges, and Ukraine is certainly reevaluating itself in the face of the most profound of challenges today, Russia's war. Ukrainians are now, I think, increasingly seeing themselves as a nation defined by resistance to empire and imperial oppression, as a post-colonial society that's going through a process of decolonization, and whose values focus on freedom and respect for human rights, the things that have been most denied under empire, and also cultural specificity. With that process, I think, which is already well underway, there must be an understanding of Ukraine as a society that's defined by the diversity and the hybridity of the imperial periphery, which one finds in all imperial peripheries. This is a fact that can be challenging to any monolithic notions of identity, but can also be a great source, a great resource when identity is understood as it is increasingly in Ukraine in civic terms. Past diversity, cultural interactions that have shaped the present are part of the story, and an understanding of this can be turned into a strength in the process of decolonization. Looking towards the Jewish past, and particularly its traumatic episodes, and particularly the Holocaust, I think will be important for Ukraine in other important ways too. Ukrainians will be living through a process of deep trauma for many years to come. We should not underestimate the effects of what's happening right now and the length of time and the difficulty and the complexity of the processes of overcoming those events. They will be dealing with the legacy of destroyed cities, of mass atrocities, mass murder, forced migration and displacement. The experience of the country's Jews, whether filtered through local Ukrainian Jews or through diasporas linked to them, will be, I think, a crucial resource in understanding, processing, and overcoming all of these things. Perhaps, indeed, this can be treated on some level as one common experience, albeit one shared in disparate and difficult ways. In order to harness this experience in the traumatized present, a focus on dialogue and openness will be indispensable. And as the poet Boris Kersonsky emphasized in a recent interview where he discussed his own commitment to, as a Jew, to Ukraine and to its culture, he said here that historical traumas are characteristic of the two peoples. I think that if we realize this, then we'll become much more tolerant of each other. Okay, thank you so much for listening, and I'll be very keen to answer any questions that you might have.
Thanks very much, William. I am wonder whether or not that's great. So we're back. Look, we have some questions on Slido to kick off with, and please do remember that if you want to connect and put in a question, it's the Slido website, and the tag is I just need to find it. I think it's at Holocaust Memorial with a capital H. So at Holocaust Memorial with a capital H. But the first question on Slido relates particularly to Holocaust commemoration and asks, how has Holocaust commemoration specifically developed in Ukraine in recent years?
Yeah, so I think this is obviously a very important aspect of everything that I've been discussing. And it has developed, perhaps looking over the perspective of the 30 years since, just over 30 years since Ukrainian independence, relatively slowly. But I think in recent years, and especially after 2014, when we had the Maidan Revolution, where we had a certain reevaluation of Ukraine's history, its identity, where it wants to be in the world, there was an increased interest in historical politics, historical memory, and there was a very profound reevaluation of the Second World War. So up until then, you know, the initial years of Ukrainian independence, Ukraine is still sort of following that Soviet model of commemorating the Great Patriotic War. A lot of people in Ukraine are still kind of sticking to that model. Not everyone, some people profoundly disagree with that. And then you see different, a kind of attempt to combine the two, whereby we talk about the Soviet victory and we celebrate that, but we also talk about the Second World War as a great tragedy. We talk about the Holocaust as well, and sort of combining the more, let's say, European model, which focuses on remembrance and focuses on the losses and the atrocities and the lessons that can be learned from that, with that kind of more victory-oriented Soviet discourse. And now we see it sliding kind of more and more towards the European model. And the Soviet way of commemorating the Second World War is pretty much disappearing. And we've seen various attempts to improve Holocaust commemoration. So I mentioned a very interesting project which happened in the center of Lviv, which was organized by the Center for Urban History in that city, which is a really, really excellent academic center, which looks at all questions of urban history, but focuses on the kind of multicultural, multi-ethnic nature of many Ukrainian cities and how that's remembered and commemorated. And they have a really nice, very modern, very interesting Holocaust memorial in the center of the city now. Babyn Yar, which we mentioned, is, you know, arguably the most important single site, which stands for the Holocaust in Ukraine. So this was the site of some of the first and largest mass shootings of Jews by the Nazis in occupied Eastern Europe. And for a long time was a place where there was no commemoration. A Soviet monument went up there only in the late 1970s, but didn't mention Jews, didn't mention the Holocaust, just mentioned Soviet citizens who'd been murdered by the Nazis. As soon as we get to 1991, you have this kind of commemorative chaos there. So everything's possible. You know, the Jewish community can put up a monument there. There's this menorah monument which has been put up there. But we see lots of small monuments around the site because it was a site where lots of different types of people were murdered. So first and foremost Jews, but also Soviet prisoners of war, Ukrainians and Russians, Roma, disabled people, Orthodox clergy, and so on. And each of these groups has had their own sort of little commemorative signs. And it was something of a free-for-all, and nobody is really taking ownership of the site. And it's a bit of a mess. So there's none of this censorship of memory as there was before. And the Jewish presence is there, but it's still very chaotic. And then after 2014, you saw attempts to bring that into some kind of order. It's quite a complicated story, however, the story of that, because you had competing projects for it, and this wasn't a case of Ukrainians had one project and Jews had another. It was two different projects which had Ukrainians and Jews involved in both of them. But one of them, which had all the money, was financed by oligarchs who were either from Russia or maybe had origins in Ukraine but had been living in Russia for a long time. And this raised this whole question of the influence of the Russian narrative, the kind of Soviet/imperial narrative on the Second World War. Lots of people were worried that through this being financed by wealthy Russians, it would potentially be manipulated by the Kremlin, and the site would be used to kind of manipulate historical politics. The situation there is still, at Babyn Yar, is still unresolved, because they were in the process of doing various interesting projects, commemorative, artistic, really lots and lots of things have been happening there. But then the war happened. Babyn Yar itself was hit by a Russian missile. And now that memorial project has kind of switched its resources towards documenting crimes being committed today. So you can see that kind of story is being sort of intertwined with the history and the contemporary situation, but intertwined again in this sort of strange ways. But to put it sort of briefly, a lot of things are happening. It's not always well coordinated. It's not always necessarily coherent, but it's increasingly prominent, and increasingly state resources were going into it. But yeah, that's a sort of rather convoluted answer to that question.
No, it's a fascinating answer. And of course, a part of all of that is about the telling and retelling of the story and the way that you traced the development of Ukrainian identity through it. And so the second question is that Russia's primary or one of its ideological weapons against the Ukraine is, of course, the role of the UPA in the Holocaust. Is the war also making Ukrainians think about the role of that organization in the foundation of the Ukrainian state?
I mean, it's something that has been there, so the UPA, or UPA, is the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, which was a large sort of guerrilla army which existed during the Second World War, and which essentially fought for Ukrainian independence against the Soviets and also against the Nazis. It was connected as an army. It was connected to a political organization called Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which had collaborated quite briefly with the Nazis, which saw its main enemy as the Soviets, but was then itself, the Nazis themselves cracked down on that organization as well. And there are questions of the attitudes and activities of many of the members of these organizations. It's a very, very complicated and controversial question, but it's clear that there, as in all occupied territories throughout Europe, there was an element of collaboration in Ukraine. There was an element of collaboration within these organizations. And so commemorating them unproblematically, heroicizing them today in Ukraine, raises questions about, well, what does this say to Ukraine's Jews? What does it say to Jews around the world? And it can be a difficult question, difficult problem to solve, because for many Ukrainians, these it's worth saying also that these things tend to be confined more or less to the western parts of Ukraine. Other parts of Ukraine, they're not so popular, not so high profile. If you look at the monuments, for example, they're more in the sort of western sort of quarter or third of Ukraine, and not necessarily so much elsewhere. To what extent people, when they commemorate or talk about or mention these organizations, understand that history is an open question. I think when they do endorse them or refer to them, they are either unaware of that history of anti-Semitism, or they try to ignore it. So what it doesn't mean is that people are endorsing anti-Semitism when they turn to these figures as figures who fought for Ukrainian independence. That's what's the important thing. But there's this lack of knowledge, or perhaps unwillingness to look at the complications of this history. And I think it's one thing, that I could certainly say, for having studied Ukraine, for about 20 years or so, is that these conversations and these arguments and these fights have been happening quite openly, and there's quite a robust debate. It doesn't always happen in the most edifying way, but there's an openness. There's an openness to criticism. There's a freedom to criticize, and I think those debates will continue. But I also wouldn't overemphasize the importance of those figures and of those movements. Ukrainians also have a lot of other historical figures who they can look back at, like the Ukrainian People's Republic. So after the Maidan protests, there was a big move in historical politics to look at the Ukrainian People's Republic of the early 20th century, which was a project which, of course, also had there were problematic sides. There were pogroms at the time, but politically, it was in fact more of a left-wing project, and it was a project which politically tried to include minorities and tried to look at a vision of Ukraine as a country of different ethnicities living together, because that was the reality of Ukraine at the time. And that, so for example, that's also part of the commemorative landscape, of the memory landscape in Ukraine, but that doesn't kind of attract the attention maybe of a lot of foreign journalists, for example, because it's not quite as interesting, it's not quite as controversial as, wartime Second World War collaboration.
But that does lead very naturally to the next question, which is, could you comment on the position of minorities in Ukraine more broadly in the context of the war and the political upheavals there in the last 9 years?
Yeah, so, this is also an important question. Ukraine, these days, not as diverse as it has been historically, because, to a large extent, because of the Second World War, because of the Holocaust, and because of Soviet deportations of various groups after the war, the Poles, in particular the Crimean Tatars. But still a diverse place, still a place where there are various different minorities. And what you see, I think what you saw, initially, under the Soviet Union, it would be difficult, and even going back further in history, why would someone who was a Jew or a Crimean Tatar or a Pole or a Hungarian or a Romanian living in sort of Ukrainian, let's say, loosely defined ethnic lands where Ukrainians are a majority, why would they buy into the Ukrainian national project when that's not a project which is in power? It's not a project which can offer them anything really. But you see that changing a little bit, even under Soviet Ukraine, when you had a state which was, albeit it's completely completely under the control of the Soviet Union and from Moscow, but is this independent, quasi-autonomous, state which has Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture as the language and culture of officialdom and of prestige. That was the idea. And then you see people who are not Ukrainian turning towards the language and the culture, because it can offer them something. After independence, you see quite slowly people who are not ethnic Ukrainians turning towards the idea of a Ukrainian civic nation. And that really, after Maidan especially, that became very important. You saw that it was certainly clear that among the Ukrainian-Jewish community, people were very much behind the Maidan. They were very much behind the idea of, protecting basic freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, democratic, protecting democracy. Who wouldn't be behind that? And when you had, we have the Ukrainian National Project, which is sort of based on Ukrainian culture and language, associated with the struggle for rights and democracy, then it starts to become attractive to everybody. And that's why you can see also in the case of Crimean Tatars, for example, who, we should be honest, in the first couple of decades of Ukrainian independence were pretty much ignored by the state. And there are specific problems in Crimea, which is a sort of complicated case in its own. were not necessarily taken into consideration as much as they should have been. Since the annexation, Crimean Tatars have become very, very central to kind of political life and cultural life in Ukraine, and people have been sort of trying to catch up with the Crimean Tatars as an important part of Ukrainian civic nation. And they certainly, you know, some Crimean Tatars, you know, we could talk about Jamala, who won the Eurovision Song Contest, you know, not a trivial thing, actually. Or people like film director Artem Setablayev, who's probably the #1 film director in Ukraine, or at least one of them today. You can see people really buying into this civic idea of a civic Ukraine, a European Ukraine, a democratic Ukraine, which, and buying into that and being part of that project can help protect you from the erosion of those things, of democracy, of rights that's represented by Russia today.
Look, thank you very much, Ulyaman. I think as I listened to you talking, both in your answers to questions, but also in your address itself, the thing that kept coming back as a kind of continual theme was the extent to which these issues in anti-Semitism, these issues in the history of the mid-20th century, and in particular the Holocaust, are identity constituting not only for Ukraine, but for at least all European peoples and many beyond. And therefore, to think through that issue in the specific use case of Ukraine and its relationship with Russia has been absolutely fascinating. But I think must bring each of us back to that question about ordinary people, about, you know, in what ways does the culture that I find myself a part in, and that I help both to constitute and am constituted by, in what ways is that marked by the same patterns of behavior, of ideology, of belief that led to the industrial slaughter of so many million people in the middle of the 20th century. So thank you very much for your presentation, and I'd just encourage everybody who's listening to become a part of either one of ours or other Holocaust Day memorial events over the coming week. Thank you.
Thank you.